just on behalf of Student Services and the university, we do want to thank all of you for participating in this conversation. Every year, we try to host what we call an MLK Interfaith Dialogue. And that's to bring together faith communities so that we can have a conversation on how we can come together and then move forward. So I appreciate each one of you being here and participating in this event. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Barnes to continue.
Okay, great. I want to echo what Robert had shared by thanking all of you for joining us and making these kinds of opportunities available to our students and our community to engage in conversations that are pivotal. I also wanted to take a moment to thank the university for sponsoring events like these, Mr. Pleasant for spearheading these types of events, Noelle Payne for all that she did to secure our speakers and coordinate this event and help create an opportunity for a discussion about faith and race that includes a balanced perspective. So I want to thank all of you for being here today, Father Bailey, Imam Abdusalam, Reverend Tyson, Rabbi Judd. I want to thank you so much for being here. And before we jump into our conversation, I wanted to give all of you a moment or two to introduce yourselves to our audience.
Any particular order?
Yeah.
Any order, any order.
I'm Pastor Margaret Tyson. I pastor two congregations in this area, Allen Chapel AME Church in Portsmouth and Quinn Chapel AME Church in Ironton. And I've been in this area for about 6 or 7 years now, coming from, actually I'm from the New York, New Jersey area, but I came from Pennsylvania and then here.
Father Bailey, would you like to introduce yourself next? Bentley, excuse me.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Father Mark Bentley. I'm a parochial vicar, so sort of like the associate pastor at Holy Family Catholic Church in Ashland and St. Lawrence Mission in Greenup. I moved to the area. I was assigned here in July, so July 1st of last year. So I'm still new to the area, and I don't recommend moving in a pandemic.
Well, welcome.
So I guess that's either myself or the rabbi. I'll let the rabbi go first.
Thank you. I'm Rabbi Robert Judd. I'm in Huntington, West Virginia. I have a small congregation here in Huntington. And like the father, I am relatively new. My partner and I moved out of Brooklyn in March and came here. So we got out of Brooklyn at the right time, and we're actually really enjoying the area and can't wait for it to open up again.
Well, welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
That's interesting because I'm also in West Virginia, but in Charleston. I'm the Imam of the Islamic Association of West Virginia, and also not from West Virginia. So I've been here a little bit longer. This is my 3rd year. I'm originally from Atlanta, and I actually came from overseas. I lived in Jordan and a stint in Egypt for over a decade. So I came back from there, stayed back home in Atlanta for about 6 months, and then off to West Virginia, where I've been the imam, like I said, for almost 3 years.
Well, we're happy to have you in West Virginia as well. And we apologize for all the cold and the snow.
Well, it makes me feel a little bit better, but coming from Georgia, I got to get used to it still after 3 years.
Well, I grew up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, so I'm still waiting for it to get cold here. So I guess everything is relative.
Yeah, all about perspective.
Well, thank you all for taking a few moments to introduce yourselves to our audience. And moving forward, I think what we'd like to do, we have a series of questions. I shared those with all of you by email in advance. And of course, we may have some Q&A at the end from people who are joining us and catching the conversation. What I would like to do is kind of just let you jump in whenever you want to with answering the question. And I think that in regards to the question itself, you may, interject a couple of times based on what someone else has said in their response to the question. So I just want to keep this as organic as possible. We may or may not get through all of the questions that were sent to you in advance, but I think the conversation is what is most important. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our first question. So we know that for many, the topic of race isn't one that's easy to discuss. What made you accept our invitation to participate in this dialogue?
Question before we get into answering the questions, about how long should we take, like in terms of time limit?
Robert, what do you think?
I haven't had that question before, so uh, just do what you need to do. I'd say just
Yeah.
just do what you need to do. Yeah, this is what the conversation is about. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and this be the first for the first question. I think it's very important to have open discussions so that we can come to solutions, real practical solutions and effective solutions. If there's a reluctance to speak and to speak freely and openly, then you really can't have any resolution. You really won't know what people are going through, how they feel, how they think, and you won't know how to work together unless you speak, unless you speak on it. So that's always the first step. And also from the Islamic perspective, uh, we have and this is in other religions as well, but repentance. Muslim scholars have said that there's four pillars to repentance, and of course, also an Islamic perspective, but that's probably shared. Racism and racial oppression is sinful. So, in order for there to be a repentance from uh, racial or racialized, sinfulness, there has to be a remorse that's felt. There has to be an admission of what happens. Uh, there has to be a resolve not to return to doing the act, and there also has to be uh, a paying back what was taken if the sin involves the rights of someone else, and all of that is dependent on getting everything expressed, verbally. So uh, that's the reason why I'm happy to participate.
Um, for me, I think it's important that we recognize and accept our differences while we embrace the things that make us community. I'm unashamedly a Black woman and a preacher and an advocate for humanness. And I think it's important to continue to talk to everybody to find out what's going on. I love what you said, Imam, about repentance and sin, because I do believe that racism is sin. Anyway, that's why I accepted.
So I'm here because, I believe that faith leaders aren't supposed to run away from talking about tough subjects, right? Part of our calling is that we embrace the joys and the sorrows of people's lives. And racial issues are a real source of sorrow for so many people, and the wounds lay so deep. We're supposed to model healthy dialogue, talking together as fellow human beings. And we're also supposed to be models of empathetic listening, of hearing other people, their perspectives. We're not perfect at it. We're all growing, but we're supposed to try to grow in it and model it for our brothers and sisters. That's why I'm here.
I'm here. I've been involved in these kind of dialogues for over 30 years. I have probably two reasons. I have a personal reason. One is that as a Jew, I understand, much like the Imam, the steps of repentance, right? Where we have similar steps, where we have to acknowledge the wrong that's been done. We need to apologize if we can. We need to make sure that we don't fall back into it. And then we need to work towards, especially in a communal, if it's a communal sin, to eradicating the problem. As a Jew, I understand, there are gaps in my family tree because the inherent anti-Semitism or the racism that was left unchecked in places in Europe led to ultimately the Holocaust. And so I've taken that as one of the pillars that I base my life on, is to not allowing that to happen to anybody ever again, and to fight to make sure that people are treated fairly, equitably. As an individual, I think that we're created B'Tselem Elohim, that's Hebrew for in the image of God, and that we all have innate holiness. We're all worthy of respect and love. And while there are differences, right, the Creator didn't create us from the same mold, because that would be very boring. So there are many, many differences that we should celebrate, but there are also the things that unify us, I think, are much greater than the things that might separate us, that might make us different from one another. And so that's why I'm here.
Thank you all. In many churches and places of worship, the issue of race is not discussed. And I think from your answers to the first question, I can pretty much infer that all of you would agree that this is a mistake. Can I ask you, so I'm going to wing it a little here. Can I ask you in what ways do you attempt to introduce this topic with members of your congregation?
I'll just bring it up. As I like to tell my congregants, I have a bully pulpit, and if I want to talk about something, I'll talk about it. And but the idea for me is the reason that I talk about it, and I don't always just talk about it when there are big items like the racial unrest or the civil unrest, not the racial, the social unrest of this past summer. I mean, I'll talk about it when things are relatively quiet or when there's nothing in the news, because I want it in front of people. I want them to think about it. I know for many people, and I'll talk for my congregants, that if I talk about something in the synagogue, that's a signal to them that it's important. That if the rabbi is going to take time to talk about this, we should listen. It's something important. On the flip side, if I don't talk about something, they might think that it's not important. And by ignoring difficult conversations, I feel that I would be sending a message that it's not important. And so while I might take some heat for it, I might, rattle somebody's change. There might be pearls clutched, depending upon what I'm talking about. I find it necessary to keep, especially these important ideas of racism and and people not feeling that they have full rights in a community in the fore, so that my people will think about them, even if I have to, drag them into the conversation.
For me, it's not something that I have to bring up, because it's something that we constantly live, and we see it on the television. We feel it when we walk down the street. I do have a couple of non-Black people, that sounds really strange, who come into worship, but racism is just, that's the baseline. And then we move from there, and how do we live within that culture? How do we live and continue to love our neighbor? How do we continue to talk to one another? How do we continue to address the fact that there's groups of privilege and groups of non-privilege? So it's not something that I have to think about. If we're looking at a scripture, we can see immediately when we're doing Bible study where racism comes in, and how do we talk about that in the world, what's going on in our daily lives. It's just a fact. It's part of the isness of who we are.
I know for me, I really don't talk about it enough. Part of it's because, again, I'm transitioning to a new community, getting to know people, getting to know the wider community, I'll try and put in a little thing here and there, maybe some of my preaching, but no. Right now as a parish, we're limited. Like we're not doing Bible studies. We aren't doing that much due to the pandemic. I think it's important to do more. I think it's important to bring these issues to the forefront. One thing that I have on my heart and my mind is maybe leading a study of a recent document from the US Catholic bishops on the issue of racism that was begun after Charlottesville a few years ago, and really dive into that document and how it guides us as Roman Catholics to really consider the impact of racism and steps that we can do as a faith community going forward to bring about racial equity.
When I speak to my community members, it's a little bit different because half the community is African American. So it would be like preaching to the choir. We all are on the same page. We already know. And then the other segment of the community is mostly immigrants or people from immigrant backgrounds, second generation, third generation, either from Pakistan and India or from Arab countries. So what I found on this issue is that there's a lot of, I don't want to say ignorance, but there's a lot of confusion about American history and American culture. So usually when I bring up issues like this, it's to clarify the history of America, so that when people that don't have a long history, you know, their ancestors were not here, when they see certain events take place, or when they hear some of our, you know, our members that are, you know, African American, when we speak about certain things, they can appreciate why we're saying it, where we're coming from, and that there's a deep history to it. And that helps people to realize that, you know, we are natural allies, because a lot of Muslims have felt discrimination and prejudice. But in recent years, we'll say since 2001, for obvious reasons. So they can somewhat relate, but so I don't have to go to a full explanation or trying to recruit people to be a part of a cause of justice. But it's been a very interesting experience.
Thank you all. What do you consider the most important thing that you can do in your role as a faith leader to help promote racial equity and unity in our community?
I don't want to start talking and talk at the same time. The most important role that I serve, and you know, I'm sure that everyone would agree. We always like to put things in a theological perspective first and foremost, or yeah, a scriptural perspective, and remind people that we are all, you know, valuable to God. as human beings, as children of Adam, we have a very special place within the creation, and that's within every single person. So when we speak about these, cultural and political issues, they're always founded in an understanding of human nature and who the human being is. And the more that belief is cultivated in people's hearts, the more that you're going to see that come out in practice, because people will act on what they really believe. So that's the most important role, I think, is reinforcing that understanding of human nature and the value of a human being. From a more social and political standpoint, I try to emphasize the communal nature of spiritual progress. Um, a lot of times we have a tendency to think in terms of individuality, which is fine because everybody has their personal relationship with God and getting closer to God. But if you focus too much on the individual aspect without any attention paid to the environment or the community, it kind of it doesn't match up. It makes it really, it could be an overwhelming burden to try to be this island of attempted righteousness where the community, there's nothing within the culture, nothing in the society as a whole that supports that. So I try to remind, whenever I get the opportunity, and not just for issues of race, but just issues of morality and spiritual growth in general, that we're individuals and we're all individually on our path, but we also have to work together and make sure that our community is growing if we're all going to be successful at an individual level. So it's together.
I preach a gospel of inclusion. We're all made in the image of God, and I've heard that said earlier. So I try to stay in dialogue with those of different ethnicities as well as different faiths. I try to be visible and present in city government and speak up for my community on issues where we might be left out or overlooked because we have a social justice aspect to what we believe. And all of that while teaching that we have to firmly remain committed to loving neighbor as we love self. So what I do within my community is that we talk to one another and we actually try to be the neighbor in the community.
As an educator, I think that's and I agree with everything that's been said. One of the things that I've used in my rabbinate is the teachings of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a civil rights leader back in the 60s and early 70s. And one of the things that he did is he got out from behind his desk and he went out into the communities. And so one of the things that I try to do is lead by example. Is that when I know that there's an interfaith meeting or there's a rally or there's some sort of a prayer vigil, and I have knowledge of it and opportunity to go, I go there and I represent the community and I let my congregants know, hopefully hoping that they will see me and think, okay, let's go and do this. Because what I found is if I just stand on my pulpit and talk and not do anything, that's only half the message. The other half is, yeah, we can talk about it all day, but talk doesn't change things. Action changes things. So I need to be active so that my people will hopefully follow suit. And I think that for me is the biggest piece. As my father used to say, talk is cheap. Action is where it's at.
I think for me, it's listening. I've got to be able to hear perspectives that aren't my own. I've got to be able to try to see the perspective or the situation from another's perspective. I totally agree that we need to act. Like, it can't just be an act of listening. It has to be going out and using what I've heard or what we've heard to truly make an impact. Before I act, I really need to listen to discern if that I'm truly advocating for what needs to be changed. Whether it's what I think needs to be changed, that doesn't really matter in so many ways. I have to listen to what other people's experiences are. Before I speak up, I have to listen and know whether it's truly my voice that needs to be heard or that of another. And most of the time, my voice is not the one that needs to be heard. I think listening is so often overlooked, but it's that first step. It's not the only step, but for me, it has to be the first step.
Thank you all. And you know, we briefly spoke about some of the tragedies that transpired over the course of the last spring and over the summer that kind of brought to our attention the palpable inequity that continues to exist. And this kind of inspired this next question. And some of you may or may not have experienced members of your congregation coming to you and speaking to you about this, but I'm curious, how would you describe the reactions of members of your congregation following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the social unrest that followed?
I'm going to speak. We were hurt. We are hurt. We're outraged. We're fed up with the dichotomy in the justice system. We watched as the breath was squeezed out of George Floyd. It was live and in person. There was hurt and outrage at the death of Breonna Taylor in her home, in her bed. But those were just two examples of the systematic racism that I find in this country. I can't help but remember the total lack of response to this particular Ironton community, and to my congregation when 9 Black Christians from Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston were killed, and that was a sister congregation, and then the police took the murderer out for burgers and fries, and we continue to live those hurts. We continue to remember those kind of situations, especially when we look at what happened here in light of the storming of the Capitol and the fact that there had been Black Lives Matter. And when the Black Lives Matter march was, all you saw was police and people in fatigues and army all around the Capitol. But when this other riot took place, the police were overwhelmed and not in evidence. It reminds me of the Abe Meeropol poem from 1937, Strange Fruit, which was then put to music. It just that no matter where you look, there are bodies littered. They're no longer on poplar trees, but they're on in the street. They're in the gas station. They're in your bed. They're in next door, walking across the grass or the commons. At any rate, I will back up, but it hurts because it keeps happening. I was in a dialogue recently, well, about a year or so ago, with a white congregation here in Ironton, and they were talking about not understanding what is white privilege, and that was odd to me because they could point out that they had their own problems, that they're Appalachian, and there are occasions where they don't get respected by the police. But my response to that is, when you go home, you're still white. And when I go home, I'm still Black. So yeah, you asked for the reaction, and the reaction is hurt, and it's still hurt. And we continue to teach others about the hurt, but it's still hurt. I'm sorry if I was too long.
Not at all. Thank you for sharing your personal experiences. I think it's really important for people to be able to connect with what all of you are sharing, and to share something so that you're so emotionally connected to. I want to thank you for doing that. Thank you.
I guess I will go second. Um, it was a similar reaction. Again, just based on the demographics of the mosque here. You have an element of extreme hurt and sadness for those of us that could very personally relate uh, to those crimes, and then also some shock coming from those that might not necessarily be able to relate. A shock at just the level of just blatant violence, and not only that, but the aftermath in terms of no accountability. Of course, this is why I mentioned before about having a familiarity with history, and how one's knowledge or lack thereof of history will have an effect on the intensity of the reaction. So, I mean, I hate to put it in these terms, but for many of the Black members, it hurts, and it's very very saddening. But I don't want to say we've gotten used to it, but it's something that we know what it is. So we're not shocked, and we're not surprised, and to see some of our our immigrant brothers, or brothers that don't have a a long history, um, they really were like, wow, this is the type of stuff that y'all are talking about. And unfortunately, we had to affirm that, yes, this is what we're talking about. And those two situations, the only difference is that now we have modern media, but it's been going on for generations. So to clarify that, it was a very interesting experience.
For me, I was at that time finishing up an assignment at a very small parish in a very conservative county, and a very conservative parish, mostly white, majority white parish, very small parish. I know some parishioners were shocked by the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. But many of them were also really deeply untroubled by the unrest that we saw this summer. And sadly, I would say that many of them were more uncomfortable, made more uncomfortable by the unrest than by the deaths, and that's just wrong. It was a little scary trying to think about how to preach about it, because I knew for me, I felt like I couldn't live out that prophetic vocation that a preacher's supposed to have without mentioning it at some level, even in a very conservative area. Early June, I preached a homily that touched on some issues connected to racism, did some soul searching, and I used the words "Black lives do matter," and that was I was very nervous about that. Didn't know how that would go over. Spoke the names of some of the victims from the pulpit: Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and a few others. And again, not knowing how people would react. It was a muted response. Some appreciated the issue being brought up, even though the homily didn't try to resolve anything. It can't be resolved in a 10-minute homily, but just trying to stir up some things, to stir up people's empathetic imagination, or just trying to get the conversation started. That was kind of my goal there as I was transitioning out to a different parish.
I had just started here in the middle of April, so I was still starting to learn the people and how they view things. But one of the things that, well, I mean, there's no word to say it. I don't want to say I was pleased at the reaction. But they were stunned, and they were upset that this kind of murder goes on relatively unchecked in the country. And the only reason why we were hearing of it is that it happened to get caught on social media, right? And that was an opening for me to start talking about the long history of this kind of racial murder that goes on, often undocumented, except in the communities where it happened, and often brushed under the table or under the carpet. One of the things that a number of my people wanted to know, and this is something I still try to, I don't have a great answer for them, is that they wanted to know how they could reach out to members of Huntington's Black community and not be seen as, smarmy or disingenuous. What could they say that would be accepted? What kind of words? And I said, I don't know. I don't know the community. I don't know. But if it comes from your heart, and if you're coming from a place of really wanting to reach out and to extend a hand, I said, then there's no wrong way to do it. I said, but it's got to be, you've got to feel genuine about it. You just can't say, oh, too bad, I'm so sorry. That doesn't cut it anymore, because that's been the response from a large swath of the white community for too long. We're sorry it happened. Oh well. And then the next time, we're sorry it happened, without really wanting to reach out and to help stop it. And so that's I was. I think my community had an appropriate response in their anger, their sadness, and their stunned by the being stunned.
Thank you all. Rabbi Judd, with what you just shared in particular, and this inspires me, I'm going to jump around a little bit with the questions, because I think that what your response said connected very closely to one of the questions that we had drafted for this panel, which was, how would you encourage members of your congregation to become actively involved in efforts to end racial discrimination? I mean, in your response in particular, you talked about what you did and did not feel comfortable saying in terms of providing them guidance, but with the one thing to motivate them moving forward is the sincerity, the genuineness of that. So I want to ask all of you, and Rabbi Judd, again, please feel free to elaborate on this. What do you do? What do you tell members of your congregation to do to try to make a difference, to try to stop the discrimination and the inequity that's still there?
I guess I will go. I try to kind of reorient the conversation and help people appreciate that even though we have our beliefs about racism and that it's a sin, and that must be repented from, and that every human being has value, et cetera, et cetera. These things, I mean, they're so well known in the religion that you can almost just take them for granted, just in terms of rhetoric. So what I try to encourage people to do is be, real advocates for public policy that's going to actually provide real solutions to help Black people. Without that, you really can't. We're just talking, and you can get spiritual and get involved in all of this rhetoric, but unless there's something real that's advocated, and when I say that, I mean public policy, then it's really just me giving religious talks that even though I'm an imam and I give religious talks, it's not satisfying as a social or political resolution. And I try to give examples, historical examples, and as to what can be followed. And hopefully people, they listen to me. But I focus on real solutions in terms of putting pressure on politicians, local, state, and federal.
I've found that, thank you, Imam, we continue to try to fellowship with one another. For us, they are two small congregations, but if we interact with others, if we worship with others, if we are present when they are talking about the God that we believe in, that it makes a difference in how we see each other. If we can sit together and sing together and pray together, then it really does make a difference in how we view each other. And I'm finding even in virtual situations, as I said, we welcome everyone into our Facebook Lives on Sunday morning. And it's amazing to me, the cross-section of people who come and worship with us. But the point of it is, you won't understand me any better if you don't know how I talk to God, or that's what it is for me. And we do the social things. I'm around in city council meetings, and I participate in voter registration and all of those kind of things. But I think that we have to talk to one another. As the rabbi was saying, if you ask me what I need from you, I'll tell you. So when you want to know what's wrong, tell me that you're hurt, and share my hurt. It's the same thing we do in death or in illness or any other kind of times when the community comes together as family. Be present for me as the representative of God. And we have a way to understand each other in our humanness.
Thank you. Thank you for answering my question. Thank you for, but for me, what I tell people, I say, when we see, in the case of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or any of the number ones, I said, imagine if that happens in our community. How would you feel? You would be upset that something like that happened. And then, so we need to work in our community to make sure things like that don't happen. And I encourage my people to get involved, to go to meetings where these topics are being discussed, or if they hear somebody saying, well, racism isn't a problem, it's these are isolated events, it's not systemic, it's not this. I say if you feel comfortable, call them out on it, and if you don't feel comfortable, let me know and I'll call them out on it on your behalf. Because if we're going to build a community, right, these things don't happen in the abstract. If they're half a country away, maybe, but that doesn't make them any less important. But what we need is to strengthen our own community ties. And I tell people, imagine it was your neighbor that you spent 30 years living next to, who was pulled over by an officer of the law, someone that we all should trust, and was just murdered simply because he walked 2 steps in the wrong direction or did something. I said, how would you feel? And I said, if you feel bad about this, well, you should feel bad every time that happens. And we should redouble our efforts to make sure it never happens, because every time it does happen, that's somebody's neighbor, that's somebody's father, that's somebody's child. And we are responsible by our inaction as much as we are if we were actually doing it.
So my understanding of the question is, how would we encourage somebody who comes forward and asking for a good faith direction on how to engage in racial justice issues, what direction we would give them? I think it's telling for me that when I envision an answer to this question, I envision speaking to somebody who is white, who in many ways looks like me. And with that as my kind of underlying bias, my underlying preconception, I really thought about, again, kind of going back to the student in me, listen and read. Get that perspective. Listen to the stories of people of color from podcasts, narratives, film, documentary, TV show. Look for good, solid narratives. For me, I've had the privilege of never having to worry about a police officer pulling me over. I have never had to have that fear. And that is a real privilege. And it's only in hearing stories, hearing podcasts, or hearing documentaries about people who have had to worry about that, that I've had to think about. And that, again, and just having to think about it is a privilege, recognizing it as privilege. So, we live in a day and age where there are so many books at hand. How to be an anti-racist, white fragility. These books have come on people's radar because of the recommended reading lists that have come up. I think the first step is to educate yourself, build that perspective, gain empathy, and then use that to fight for action, to really push solid public policy. As a person of faith, as a Roman Catholic priest, I don't know if it's my role to specifically lay out what that public policy should look like, but I think it's my job to stir up that conversation and say that things aren't right. What are we going to do about it? We got to do something. What are we going to do?
Y'all excuse me. It was very interesting to me, Father Bentley, that you decided that your way of coming to understanding is to read and to study, which for me is a degree of separation from coming straight to talk to people. I just thought it was interesting. It's not a challenge, it's just interesting.
And that probably speaks to my closed network. It probably speaks to my closed network, and that in itself is a bias and a privilege. So thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your comments. And I think several of you touched on some of the issues that were brought up in some of the questions that I sent to you in preparation for the panel, talking about, Rabbi Judd, you had mentioned, if people deny racism in your congregation, how would you handle that? Well, you talked about if there was somebody who came to you, speaking of someone else denying it, that you would tell them to confront it, or if they didn't feel comfortable about it, that you would confront it yourself on their behalf, because it destroys a sense of community. Father Bentley, you have repeatedly talked about empathy, and as a psychologist, that's something that sticks out to me. That's one of my biases, but it's something that all of you mentioned. Pastor Tyson, Imam Abdul Salam, all of you had mentioned the importance of relating to what other people are experiencing, their suffering, and trying to end the suffering and make the suffering right, and recognizing and appreciating our differences, but recognizing those things that unite us. Pastor Tyson in particular, forgive me, you had mentioned that quite early on, that we appreciate our differences. We aren't all created from the same mold, but that, we have to recognize those things that do unite us. So as we are looking at the major themes of this panel, I want to leave time for some questions, and one of the questions that one of our audience members had included in their registration. But I'd like to end the formal portion of the panel with this last question. Although faith should unite us, realizing that all too often faith is also a point of contention, how do you approach faith as a healer of social ills? And that is kind of a broad question, and you can interpret it in a variety of ways. But what in particular stands out to you as a way of not just reaching across different ethnicities and races, but how do you reach across different, faith systems and worldviews to help people understand that community includes all of us, not just some of us?
I would say that, of course, obviously there's differences between the religions, but there's also commonalities, and we're also citizens of the same nation, and all of us have the best interests of the nation at heart. We all want to see our society as Americans. We want to see the society successful on every level. We want to see progress made. So if we can take that as a common grounds, and also take those common teachings in terms of the value of people, the worth that people have as human beings, then we can use that as the springboard from which we can work together to make sure that we can best represent the interest of the society in trying to make sure that people aren't harmed and that everybody is, I don't want to say everybody's comfortable, but that everybody's good in the best way that we can, materially and spiritually.
Thank you. One of the basic things that we believe is in Royal Triangle, that with God, neighbor, and self. And so it's important that we continue to demonstrate love in action, that we have the love that flows in either direction in that triangle. And the only way I can do that is by interacting with other people. Conversations like this. There used to be interfaith dialogues that we had. There was trust building we were doing, but it means that we can do it with 4 people or 6 people or 20 people, but we need to move from group to group and talk to people. Because if you don't know who I am, you can't love me. You can think you don't like me, but you've got to have some kind of interaction. And so the way I answered that was that it's our responsibility to demonstrate love in action. And that's the only way I can be a healer of social ills.
For me, were you finished, Pastor?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want to jump in.
That's okay.
Getting wrapped by your words. I really do. Thank you. But for me, it's what everybody has said thus far, but I also put the component in when I know my people are going to be doing interfaith or reaching out, is that to ask the questions, but then also give them time to answer and listen. That all too often, I know that when I've sat in interfaith groups, that the people are so quick to say, yes, Rabbi, yes, we share the same scripture, and yes, but they never let me enunciate or explain how it might be viewed differently. maybe it's a subtle difference, maybe it's a big difference. But if I don't get a chance to explain that, then I feel that, yeah, we sat at a table and it was nice, but nobody heard me.
Mm.
Nobody listened to me. And so, when I'm thrilled to be at interfaith events, I often write down on a little slip of paper for myself, listen, right? Just listen, let people talk. And there's no right or wrong answer. You don't have to jump in and say, well, I see it this way, or yeah, I listen, let the people talk so that they feel that they're heard, whether you agree or disagree. And I think, asking the questions and listening is a way to facilitate healing and understanding and growth in our communities.
I mean, I think part of all of our systems of belief include about, we're not only worried about living somewhere or just about a higher path. We're not thinking ethereally all the time. We're supposed to be thinking morally. We've got these great moral teachings that have been handed down for centuries, that are designed to help us live in community. To take the seeds of what we've been given and build an ethical worldview on them. And sometimes people of faith have not always done a good job of living out those moral implications of our beliefs. Faith ought to root us in love, compassion, and empathy. And if our faith causes us to hate and withdraw and become myopic, then maybe we should re-examine what it is we have faith in. Is it ourselves? Is it our worldview? Or is it, if, by your fruits you shall know them? I think it comes down to that.
I had a question, as I mentioned before, that one of our participants submitted when they registered for the event. And I know we're running short on time here, but I think that this is a
Christy,
really
it's hard
important.
to hear you.
I'm so sorry. Is that better, Pastor?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. So I think it's important that we include this question, if at all possible, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we're getting very close to the end of the hour, but this was the question. How can white children be taught about racial inequalities, throughout the world, including their own country and cities, without being made to feel guilty for their skin? We touched on some of this when we talked about the concept of white privilege, right? And I think that this kind of touches on that same concept.
I taught school for, 37 years, public school and private school. And most children don't come to school with preconceived notions of race, or I have not found them to. I remember this is a while ago, but I remember in first grade, my best friend was a little white girl. They don't come to it with we get those notions placed on us from adults. And so I think that, again, I guess I'm on a one note. By being in community with one another, by interacting, if you let your children play with everybody, then they begin to respect everybody.
I think it comes down to how we educate our children. If we start off by saying, you should feel guilty about this, or you should feel, then that's gonna traumatize them. We can teach them about race, and we can talk about racial issues without making this generation or upcoming generations feel as if they should walk with their heads hanging down. And I take the example from, I've done a lot of work in Germany, and I talk to a lot of people about how they handle the Shoah, how they talk about the Holocaust. And I remember the first time that there was a a young person. I was over there about 15, maybe almost 20 years ago. And they were saying, you know, with all respect, Rabbi, I don't feel guilty. And I said, well, why should you? You didn't do it. You should only feel guilty if you allow that kind of thought to continue, and if you don't do anything to stop it. I said, so you're moving the country forward. You're moving it forward. We don't forget, but we don't have to repeat it. And the only way you should feel guilty is if you allow it to happen, or if you do it yourself. And I think we could adapt a similar mentality here in America. Right? None of us were born in the 1800s. None of us were born in the early 1900s. We acknowledge that it's done, and that's the first step. And that goes back to what the Imam said at the very beginning of our discussion: is that you have to acknowledge that a problem exists, and then you can change it. You might not have caused the problem, you might not add to the problem, but the problem still exists, and it's up to us to work towards a solution. There's a teaching in Pirkei Avot, which is a book of ethical teachings from the rabbis, and it says, you know, it's not incumbent upon you to finish the work, whatever that work may be, but you're not free to ignore it either. And so, just because we're not going to solve the problem of racism in this country tomorrow, doesn't mean we can sit back and say, we'll kick it to the next generation. That's the only reason I would feel guilty, is if I didn't do as much as I could. And I would certainly never tell a child who has no idea really what race is until we set it as binary, A or B. Why can't it be A and B? Why can't it be both? Why can't we all get along in a way? And so for me, that's how I would start. And I'd look at how we're educating the children. And if the children are coming home feeling guilty, there's a problem with how the issue of race and history, there's an issue with how they're being taught.
I think that if we're talking about small children, I would definitely agree that, you know, there's not a real self-awareness of one's race in a small child. That's something that's socialized. So if they're feeling guilty at a young age, there's definitely something wrong with the way that it's being presented. If you're talking about older children that, you know, have been socialized into this, you know, the racial politics of the country, and then they feel guilty about learning things, I would say that, I mean, that's a deep question. I could be very long-winded if to speak on that, but I think that if somebody was feeling guilty and they were aware of the racial politics to begin with, then that would probably be an indication of the cultural problem in the society, to where we can't have a fair or objective understanding of what America is, for the good things and the bad things. I don't want to take up too much time, but I remember watching a documentary series on Jim Crow, and they were interviewing a woman, and this was a middle-aged white woman in the 1990s, and she did some research on her family, two of her uncles, and she realized that two of her uncles murdered a black man, and she's conducting this interview. She got very emotional, and the reason why she was so emotional, and she said this, it wasn't just the fact that they murdered a man, but it was the brutality of how he was murdered. So she got very emotional. And I remember thinking to myself, just watching the interview, when you have your own, you know, your kinfolk, you don't want to associate with that. So it created almost like a cognitive dissonance that, man, my uncles murdered a man, brutally murdered someone. My uncles who, probably gave me Christmas gifts and, hugged me and did all this. So if there's socially a cognitive dissonance that makes people uncomfortable about the ugly parts of American history, that means that they don't really understand the human nature, and human cultures. There's bad aspects of all cultures, including America. So we have to kind of review and take inventory of how we teach about America itself, so that when these bad aspects are exposed, people aren't feeling like, oh man, I want to break down because of it. We should be able to teach it and come to terms with it in a way that people can come out feeling like they can do something positive and not feeling overwhelmed with guilt.
And I have nothing to add. People normally don't turn to a Catholic priest for advice about raising children. So I'm learning along with everybody else, and I really appreciate the things that you all have shared, and I'm going to take them to heart.
I think, I mean, honestly, I could sit here for hours if all of you were willing to do that and listen to everything that you are sharing with us, the perspectives and seeing even in your own approaches to how you're answering the questions, just the unifying element. And I think that that's what's really, really important. I mean, this is the take home message here. We need to recognize our role in our communities and everyone around us as a member of our community. And we have a responsibility to make sure that the members of our community are taken care of. And I think that, pardon me, I apologize for the phone call. We're waiting on a phone call from the health department for a vaccine for my father, or I wouldn't have my ringer on. I'm so sorry. But I think that that is the take home message. And you can see in the chat, several people have commented just about how much they have enjoyed everything that you have shared, the way in which you've shared it, the realness in your responses, the emotional reactions to these very deeply personal and sensitive topics, but handled with such respect, grace, and reality. I mean, the realness is what's important. We need to recognize where we are, recognize where we want to go, and take responsibility for moving ourselves and our communities forward in that direction. So I want to thank all of you for the time that you have spent with us and shared with us. And again, honestly, if we could keep you on here for hours, or if we could do this weekly, I would sign up. I've really enjoyed this. So thank you all so much. I think we could take a moment just to see if anybody has any last minute questions or anything that any of our guests would like to share as just a closing remark. And we're already over time, so I want to be respectful of your time as well. So
Christy?
yes.
No, I just want to acknowledge my former student that I haven't seen for 15 years, Father Bentley. It is so good to see you.
Good to see you too, Salome.
This has been wonderful, and I really enjoyed listening to you and the panel, and this has been a blessing. So thank you to all our panelists. Thank you so much.
I just want to say that Dr. Normale, so I met her when I was going to my senior year of high school, Center College Governor Scholars Program. She instructed me for about 8 weeks on international relations, and it really opened my worldview. So I owe her a lot. So it's good to see you this evening.
I just want to thank you for allowing me to participate with this, because I think dialogue is important. And I have learned from each of you in the styles and the way that we all come at the same problem. It's been very rewarding for me. So I appreciate this.
I appreciate knowing that sometimes it can be very, very lonely being a person of faith. And it's always nice to know that there are other people out there pulling in the same direction. So thank you for being here.
It's great to see people from Ohio and West Virginia and Kentucky coming together and having a dialogue and not trying to argue about which side of the river is the best.
Because we already know. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Thank you for agreeing. It's my side of the river. That's all I know.
It could be that.
Can I just acknowledge all of your all's hard work within your communities? Because I don't think we all realize it, or you all realize it, that we're all having these difficult conversations on a parallel level, whether that's with the Imam, Black Muslims versus the Muslims from other origins or ethnicities. And Pastor Tyson, as you said, with white Christians and Black Christians getting together. So, and having some difficult conversations. I'd like to acknowledge that. Malcolm X actually brings me back to him when he went to Hajj. He was surprised of seeing, you know, blue-eyed, blonde-headed Muslims right there praying with him. So that just struck me too, that you would acknowledge that's the work that we got to do as well. And with Rabbi Judd, with your allyship with your community, saying, you know, reaching out and correcting stereotypes and addressing issues and providing an extra layer of support to people of color as well as non-Blacks as well, because they need that information and need to learn how to be an ally to the Black community. And lastly, Father Bentley, you have a difficult task of delivering your sermons, your messages to your congregation. I feel your pain that you can't connect as much because you don't have that diverse community, but I appreciate your empathy and just your message to your congregation to support people of color. So I just wanted to bring attention to all the parallel difficult conversations that one of our guests pointed out in our chat that we tend to, that you said, Father Bentley, run away from, but you all actually are doing the hard work. So I wanted to acknowledge that and tell you how much I appreciate that. And I'm sure that my coworkers and our community do as well. So I'm long-winded too, so I'll wrap that up.
Well, I want to thank all of you again for being here this evening. Thank you so very much for giving of your time and your experiences and sharing those with us. You made for a beautiful dialogue this afternoon and a meaningful one for all of us. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a good evening.
You as well.
Thank you. Take
Thanks
care.
for having us.
Thank you.
Peace, everyone.